Aloha kako. Welcome everybody. Um, Thanks for watching this session. My name is Noah Lincoln, presenting along with Saleh Azizi. And today we want to quickly share about some work we've been doing together on food hubs and specifically kind of documenting our food hubs responses, their role in our local food system, and then specifically how that role has evolved during the COVID pandemic. So we have put forward some of these ideas before. Um, about a year ago, we um, authored some works, including some op-eds within Civil Beat and other locations, kind of making the case for food hubs in Hawaii's food system. In particular, um, because Hawaii has a huge number of small farms, over 7,000 small farms composing a substantial portion of our farming population, as well as our total land in agriculture. Um, and these small farms tend to struggle in getting product to market. Other than direct sales and avenues such as farmer markets, many small farmers um, don't get their product to market. And food hubs, I think, fill an essential role in that sense, in providing the value chain services necessary for small farmers. Um, so, of course, the aggregation, reaching a critical mass and volume of product, food hubs are able to provide an extra layer of quality control, quality assurance of the produce. And then again, the food hub can shoulder the burden of the marketing, distribution, sales that, again, many of our small farmers simply don't have the time or expertise to engage in. Um, and so we've been making this case for a while and continue to believe that food hubs are a very key part of building out the supply chain, the access to food for our consumers, access to markets for our producers, and generally strengthening the resilience and robustness of our local food system. And so Saleh Azizi, in particular, in his role with Hawaii Farmers Union United, took the initiative to bring together representatives from the food hubs in a informal, ad hoc committee that we are calling the Food Hub Hui. And so for about 2 years now, or maybe a little longer, this group has convened fairly regularly, um, at least quarterly and probably more often. And initially, it was really just around an opportunity to share with each other and do some basic information gathering. So as the hubs initially came together, a lot of it was simply telling their story, their history, their current operations and infrastructure, what were major barriers to their growth and what had worked well for them in the past. Um, I think initially there were 7 food hubs convened, and that number has grown to 11. Um, and you can see the representation we have here in this table. Um, so food hubs that have been around for a long time, like Adaptations or Oahu Fresh, you know, food hubs that have just established in this past year, like the Maui food hubs, and everything in between, different structures as far as for-profit, nonprofit, cooperative, and a range of different products and services offered to their members. So as the Food Hub Hui met and discussed, one of the low-hanging fruits we thought was to petition our legislation to provide funding for food hubs, both to help them scale and grow, but also to gather better information about how they operate within our food system. And as we geared up for this, working with our legislators to draft some legislation, so both a House bill and a Senate bill, that called for financial support for a pilot project for food hub expansion. And one of the things we did at that time was we wanted to document the current impact of the food hubs, so that we could make the case better about their impact. And so Saleh again kind of took the lead in reaching out and generating a pretty simple survey and liaisoning with our food hubs to gather that information. And at the time, and this was again about a year ago, the 8 food hubs that were part of the Hui at that time serviced about 1,600 customers, including 7 hospitals, over 200 restaurants and hotels, and well over 1,000 families, and had about 25 full-time and 42 part-time jobs. They aggregated produce from about 664 farms and represented about $3.2 million in annual gross income. And so we, again, kind of gathered this information, put it into a little infographic, and again, coupled this with Senate and House bills to try to get further support for our food hubs. Unfortunately, as we all know, the legislative session did not finish due to the COVID pandemic, and so that did get put on hold, and also greatly changed, right, the context of our local food system. And so moving forward, Saleh is going to talk about some of the work we've done to document the impacts and adaptation of these food hubs to the COVID pandemic.
Aloha everyone, my name is Saleh Azizi and I am one part of this presentation with Dr. Noah Lincoln, and I just want to start with acknowledging all the food hubs that have been part of this study, and thank you for the work that you do every day. This map shows another before and after picture of the COVID pandemic and some of the food hubs here in Hawaii. The food hubs that existed and the 10 that we had mentioned before the pandemic are on Oahu, Molokai, Maui, and Hawaii Island. And also on this map, you can see a number of food hubs that have started as a response to the pandemic. And there's one on Kauai, 2 more on Oahu, 2 more on Maui, and 1 more on the Hilo side of Big Island. There's likely a few more food hub startups out there that we are unaware of. And the other thing that I kind of want to point out here is that the food hubs have, during this time, been connected, and their connections have been amplified, so they're buying more and selling more to one another. And that is partly because they got to know one another in the Food Hub Hui for a couple of years before this happened. Most of the people who are listening and watching this presentation already knows what a food hub is. But for those of you who might not know, I'll just repeat what a food hub is. And so a food hub is a center for aggregation and distribution of local food. One way that a food hub is a little bit different than a conventional food distributor is that food hubs source their food exclusively from local farms and not from, in the case of Hawaii, not from outside of Hawaii. So from all of the Hawaiian islands. And that is what a food hub does. And I think what it also does, it helps organize a whole community of farmers so that the farmers themselves can focus on production and utilize the support of the food hub to do marketing, sales, and distribution. So I like to think of a food hub as a one-stop shop for farmers to come and sell their fruits and vegetables, and that in turn will share these fruits and vegetables with customers as well as in community distributions. In this slide you see the central results of the survey that we did with the 10 food hubs before and after COVID, with the addition of Maui hubs that started as a response to COVID. Their results are included in the numbers post-March 2020. So the food hubs went from 25 full-time employees to 53. They went from 42 part-time employees to 93. So in effect, they more than doubled employment during the time of COVID. They were supplied by many more farmers, from 664 farmers to 900, an increase of 35% in the representation of farmers. And finally, their sales tripled during the time of COVID and went from 3.2 million to an average of 10.1 million annually during the time of COVID. I have also heard from most of the food hubs that they continued to increase sales and employment and number of farmers that supply them after they took the survey as well. So these things continue to increase. Even though most of us food hub practitioners anecdotally know that there has been immense increases with the COVID period in terms of sales and number of people hired and number of farmers supported, it was quite amazing to see the aggregate numbers of tripling compared before and after. Now, the increase of sales is generally attributed to two waves of increased purchasing from the food hubs. And one of those waves, and the first one, has to do with the increased sale of CSA, or Community Supported Agriculture boxes, with home deliveries. And the second wave of that is due to food hubs' involvement with community food distributions. Even before that, the food hubs experienced a short period of loss of sales, and this period was anywhere from 1 week to 4 weeks in some cases. During this period, many of the food hubs that relied on hotels and restaurants, and also the public institutions like the Department of Education, lost a lot of their sales due to COVID closures in both schools and in the restaurants. It wasn't uncommon to hear, as one food hub said, "We primarily sold direct to restaurants. In 1 week, we almost lost all business. Before COVID, restaurants made up 75% of our sales." And that was quite a common story of the experience of loss before the waves of increase hit the food hubs. Some of the food hubs had already transitioned from relying on wholesale and restaurants to the CSA model before COVID hit, and one of those examples is Oahu Fresh. for example. And so when the COVID hit, the food hub of Wahoo Fresh increased from roughly 100 subscriptions per week to about 1,100 per week. And one of the things that they had allowed, which many other food hubs ended up doing as well, was to allow people to make their own boxes. So there's a combination now of ordering a pre-made box or make your own box online, and that was partly what attracted a lot of new customers. Many other hubs followed in the same suit and started offering make your own box, and it was something that people started preferring instead of going to the store. The store was associated with a risk for getting COVID, and so many people turned to the food hubs, especially with the new option of having home delivery. And this is a trend that we could see on the United States continent as well, and not only here in Hawaii. Before I go into explaining the second trend of increased sales, I first have to explain something about most of our food hubs here in Hawaii. The food hubs, many of them have started to improve access to food for low-income people in their communities. So the food hubs are extremely community-oriented, and even before COVID hit, had tried several innovations to allow for people of low income to access fresh and affordable foods. One of those innovations is the Double Bucks program, in which the Hawaii Food Basket has been instrumental in spreading around the state of Hawaii. So understanding this intention of our food hubs to help people of low income access nutritious food and local food, there comes the second trend in the increased sales of the food hubs, which have to do with community food distributions. This trend is almost entirely funded through federal grants money, the CARES Act, that has trickled down to the county, and in many of the counties it was decided that you should spend those monies on local food. And so the food hubs became instrumental in turn on providing locally grown fruits and vegetables and meats and value-added products for community distributions. And that became the big second trend of increased sales. It wasn't only the food hubs that had the contract for community distribution that benefited from community distribution, but because of the connection among the food hubs, just as they had done with increased CSA sales, they were connected and bought from one another. So it could be that one or two food hubs had the contracts, but ended up purchasing and sourcing out a lot of the work to other food hubs. And in that way, one contract benefited multiple food hubs and many, many hundreds of farmers behind them. But generally, it was also a period of sharing and a period of higher trust. So food hubs would not necessarily hold on to their growers and demand high premiums from one another. In the cases where they saw fit, they connected one food hub with one of their growers because of convenience and because of concerns with product quality. Several of the food hubs on Big Island and Maui that had connections with farmers on Oahu, Maui, and Big Island sometimes would connect another food hub directly to a farmer to not be the person in between and to allow for more efficient and shared systems. A short summary of the first part of the surveys and the interviews that we did with the food hubs of explaining the increased sales that happened with the COVID pandemic. So the increased sales in CSA were largely because of the extra home delivery options that that food hubs started offering. It was also because of the public's risk associated with going to the store and being out in the open rather than at home and enclosure. It was also associated with the food hubs offering more products and really offering quite a big store to pick and choose all the necessities associated with going to the store. And then the fourth thing that I wanted to point out here is that this is a privately funded trend. So this is a lot of people who could afford sitting at home and could afford supporting um, their local farmers through buying these fruits and vegetables and other locally grown products. On the other hand, there was another trend, and that was the trend for increased community food distributions, where the food hubs were hired as allies to basically feed the people in Hawaii of low income and people who, for the first time, experienced unemployment because of the layoffs. So many of the food hubs have missions that were centered around access to food for low income, and because the COVID pandemic resulted in widespread unemployment, there was an increased need for community food distributions. And then finally, what I'll say is that this is a publicly funded trend, and the food hubs were first hired in this when the county started dispersing the federal funds of the CARES Act money. So the food hubs were not involved in all community food distributions. They were only involved in some of them, but the ones that they were involved with caused a immense increase in sales for the hubs. Now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about what kind of trends supported these increase in sales. At large, what both of these trends showed is that there was an increased need for organizations that had spent time aggregating multiple farmers. And so it was almost as if um, the food hubs had built for years something that was going to be valuable first when the pandemic hit. And we didn't quite know how valuable the networks that we had built were until the pandemic struck. The massive increase in sales during the corona pandemic had to be supported by increased purchasing of local food. 83% of the food hubs agreed or strongly agreed that they had increased purchasing of local food, and 75% of them said that new suppliers had joined their networks. And so, in effect, what ended up happening was that hubs increased purchasing from farmers who were already in their network. They also had new farmers join their network. Many of those new farmers were considered conventional farmers that had relied on markets that ended up collapsing with the corona pandemic. One of those markets, for example, was Chinatown, that had many farmers supplying Asian greens and green onions, everything from choy sum, bok choy, and mustard greens. They all of a sudden had nowhere to go, and some of the food hubs had connected with them before the pandemic, and they were able to redistribute their produce to the hub that in turn sold it through CSA or community distributions. Hubs also increased purchasing from other hubs. Some food hubs had such large CSA programs that they might have entirely sourced one or two ingredients in their CSA program from another food hub. Another explanation to purchasing more local food is that hubs on Oahu increasingly purchased from hubs and from farmers directly on Maui and Hawaii Island. The last point can be illustrated from this chart that shows Kahumana Farm Hub's purchases from Hawaii island. And these purchases are from one food hub and from one small farmer. And so back in September 2019, Kahumana did not used to purchase any food from outer islands. And fast forward to March and April in 2020, when the pandemic struck, uh, our food hub quickly reacted and started purchasing more and more food. Never during this time did we hear that there was a lack of food. Nobody ever said, I'm out, or nobody said, I can't meet that order. As the orders came in, people filled them, and within our networks, we created multiple avenues for different varieties of crops. And so the networks are now stronger than they were before COVID, and especially the inter-island networks. So more local sales and more food purchased resulted, of course, in more people's hired. And this for me is one of the most exciting parts of this story to share with you. So employment in our food hubs doubled. 83% of the hubs ended up hiring more people. Several of our food hubs reported that they were hiring more people who were laid off from tourism, the decline in tourism, and from other parts of their nonprofit organizations. Several of us had people in certain departments that were almost entirely laid off that we were able to rehire because of the increase in sales in food hubs. And so I'm trying to explain a little bit of the characteristics behind hiring more people. Many of the food hubs ended up hiring temporary workers. Many of them were overqualified. And what the hubs ended up emphasizing was people not that were had a specialized skill in one thing or another, but rather people that were community driven, flexible, and open to do a multiple different activities. And so here's a really good description from the food basket on Big Island. We were hiring people who were willing to jump in the trenches when we needed extra hands at a community drop, and that I can count on to have safe behavior given the pandemic. And at the same time, they're not afraid of jumping into a truck and drive or lend a hand with a loading produce or packing produce. And so it really shows the spirit of people that the food hubs were looking to hire during this time. I've now spoken for quite a long time, and I'm getting ready to summarize the results of the research here, and will be here and open for questions. One of the first points that I'd like to discuss is how local food went from somewhat of a luxury to an essential need during this time, and where many of us food workers felt like first responders to the COVID pandemic. Before the pandemic, local food systems, small farmers, and even food hubs had been considered an alternative that was quite often only accessed by people who could afford these kinds of high quality and quite often organic food. Now, with the pandemic, many of food hubs had to be in the first line of response, reacting quickly to the community's need for food when other sources had failed. And just a reminder here that most of the food hubs and most of those 900 suppliers that support the food hubs are considered small farmers. Some of them don't even consider themselves farmers. Many of them have said in other studies that they have been excluded from the supply system or supply chain because they cannot provide things on a consistent basis. They might be growing bananas or mangoes or something in their backyard, and this is just part of how they live their life. They grow food and they share food with their neighbors and with their families. So the food hubs came in and fit quite nicely with that way of life that so many people in Hawaii enjoy. Um, but they also end up utilizing those resources so that so much of that does not go to waste and creates an extra income opportunities for farmers. Another topic that we quite often talk about in food systems is access to local food. And we often speak of it in terms of providing affordable and nutritious food um, for low income people. But too often do we discuss this in isolation from access to markets for suppliers or for farmers. In this study, we argue that food hubs are providing an important access to market for many producers, and in turn, they are allowing um, for access to affordable and nutritious local food. One cannot happen without the other, and for people who want to provide an improved access and what's called the built food environment, they would also have to address access to markets by farmers. A discussion that comes up quite often today is how we will sustain this heavy purchasing of local food beyond the pandemic. Currently, it is looking as if the CARES Act money that has been distributed from federal government to county governments is going to end at the end of this year, and where many of our food hubs will lose up to 50 and in some cases 75% of their business and employees if nothing kicks in after that. Currently, it's a temporary trend, but there are several ways to make the temporary trend more permanent. And here we have identified several support structures for food hubs moving into the future. We have spoken a little bit about the Food Hub pilot program, which we intend again to introduce in the legislature with our legislative partners, as Noah had mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. This piece of legislation will provide funding to start food hubs in places where they don't exist and to strengthen food hubs in communities where they exist. And the strengthening of food hubs is mainly done through infrastructural support for their warehouses, for their transportation, and for their food safety. This Food Hub pilot program received very good feedback in this legislative session, but did not see the end of it. So we are very hopeful for the next year and receiving support for this piece of legislation. Another thing that is clearly coming out of this study and the experience of food hubs during COVID is their function as centers for retraining and redevelopment. We're seeing a threat to tourism in Hawaii that many of us never could imagine, where tourism went to 0 visitors over the span of 1 week, and where over 200,000 jobs were lost. And the food hubs, as being part of the community food distribution chain, picked up a lot of activity and a lot of those people that worked in the tourism industry. One of the reasons for that is that many of the restaurants and hotels in the tourism industry had connections with the farmers and with the food hubs before the pandemic. And when they were laid off, coming and joining the food hub team was a close option that they could, how they could sort of put themselves out there in the job market. And many people who were laid off from tourism were hired by the food hubs. Those programs could be formalized, and we could look at policies for workforce development in food systems and in agriculture, and especially around the food hubs. We could also continue to serve community through institutional purchasing and food bank and community food distributions purchasing. We have seen good examples during the pandemic where public programs have paid farmers fairly for their produce and created alternative avenues to get that produce to the consumers here in Hawaii. And continued support for these types of programs would essentially come to help our small farmers and our food hubs to pave a new way, I would say, into the future. Finally, last but not least, it was our local food system that we had relied on as a niche or an alternative that stepped in when disaster hit. And this is most likely what will happen in the case of other disasters as well. It's the local people and the local organizations that react the quickest, that know their own community, and can meet the needs of the community in those times. We suggest that the food hubs truly kicked in and became quite a support system for our community during the pandemic, and that this is now a good time to strengthen these hubs to act as more of a mainstream infrastructure between local production and local consumption moving into the future. Many of these considerations have now made it into the Hawaii Farmers Union United policy statement. Several new policies are being suggested, are being recommended for this session, and those include continuing community food distributions and working directly with the food bank. HFUU policy on food hubs also include fair representation, where the food hubs have asked that there is a stakeholder task force that can prioritize purchasing by institutions from the food hubs here locally. And there are other more disaster-related policy recommendations that suggest to use the infrastructure of our food hubs as a measure of resilience moving forward to be better prepared when the next disaster strikes. Again, I would like to thank each of the food hubs for the work that you do every day, for the many farmers that you support here in Hawaii, for the many people that you employ, and for the many consumers that you serve here in Hawaii. Mahalo, and it's been a pleasure to be part of the Food Hub Hui, a circle of practitioners with you. Feel free to address any questions to me, and also feel free to contact me regarding anything that has to do with food hubs and Hawaii Farmers Union United policy. Mahalo and a hui hou.